Welcome everyone. This class is GSA SmartPay Advanced Purchase Card Management. This class is geared for experienced AOPCs who are looking for more in-depth information on how to work within the gray areas of your program. The prerequisite for this class is GSA SmartPay Purchase Management Essentials. I'm Shauna Weatherly, Business Management Specialist with the GSA Center for Charge Card Management. My primary role is working as the contracting officer's representative for the SmartPay 3 master contracts with both Citibank and US Bank. But prior to coming to the GSA SmartPay program in 2016, I was a warranted contracting officer for over 25 years and have both DWIA contracting and FACC Level 3 certifications and have held those since 2001. I still also have a current FACC and COR Level 3 certification as well. My area of expertise when I was a contracting officer was service contracting, and I gained that knowledge in a variety of roles, ranging from a branch chief for construction, architect, engineer services, all the way to a chief of contracting, a director with FAA for aviation, medical, and training acquisition needs, and also our facilities management branch. And then with GSA, I was a senior contracting officer and acquisition workforce training and development coordinator for the travel, transportation, and logistics category. So the reason I'm teaching this class is I have quite a bit of knowledge that I'm bringing from over 34 years of acquisition and card experience. I've also held just about every role a cardholder or supervisor could hold managing the program, and I've survived several charge card program audits as well. As the GSA SmartPay purchase card subject matter expert, I'm regularly asked to answer a lot of questions like we're going to discuss today when it comes to purchase card and review agency purchase card policies. These questions that I've received is actually how this course came into being. We've tried to provide you a large swath of information and knowledge and regulatory guidance, and again, best practices to use as a reference as you manage your own programs. We've got a lot to cover today, so let's get started. This course picks up where the GSA SmartPay Purchase Essentials class leaves off and is a deeper dive into subjects that AOPCs deal with on a daily basis. We've had a lot of interest in a class that takes a more detailed look at how to classify purchases for the appropriate application of micro purchase thresholds, or MPTs. Everything I will talk about today during this presentation and more is included in the course materials that will be available for download online. Nothing I say here today overrules agency and/or local policies for the use or management of the purchase card program at your agency level. We will be speaking directly from the viewpoint of what the Federal Acquisition Regulation, or the FAR, and the OMB Circular A-123 Appendix B dictate. We'll also talk about some Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR, some U.S. Code, which are USCs, and labor law information thrown in, again, as well as best practices. This is all an effort to help maximize the use of your program under ever-increasing micro-purchase thresholds. And what does maximizing the use of the program get you? Streamlined buying and refunds. So here's a quick rundown of the learning objectives we're going to cover in our session today. And by the time we're done, you should be able to analyze transactions and apply the correct micro-purchase thresholds based on a definition of supplies, construction, and services, apply statutory exemptions when applicable, operate within gray areas to support your mission needs, understand reporting requirements, apply best practices for program oversight touching on those required by OMB Circular A-123 Appendix B, and be aware of recent purchase card audit findings. We will not discuss innovative uses or other specifics on tools that are available to include use of data in this presentation. GSA offers classes at the forum that cover those subject areas in detail, and we highly recommend you taking those courses in conjunction with program-specific courses to expand your knowledge in those areas. The micro-purchase thresholds are found in the Federal Acquisition Regulation, or FAR, Subpart 2.101 under Micro-Purchases. Every 5 years, a review of FAR thresholds is completed by the FAR Council to determine if any thresholds should be changed due to inflation. The year 2020 was a review year, and the only change that impacts the government purchase card program was the increase for purchases made in support of contingency operations that are awarded, performed, or purchased outside the United States. Effective October 1st, 2020, the threshold increased from $30,000 to $35,000 for this inflationary adjustment, as you can see at the bottom of the screen. The $35,000 is in bold. While dollar thresholds in the FAR are reviewed every 5 years for inflation, the micro-purchase exceptions and the lower thresholds for construction and services are established by statute. The construction micropurchase threshold exception and lower threshold of $2,000 is set by the construction wage rate requirements, formerly known as the Davis-Bacon Act of 1931. The micropurchase threshold exception and lower threshold of $2,500 applies to services covered by the Service Contract Labor Standards, formerly known as the McNamara-O'Hara Service Contract Act of 1965. These thresholds have been in place since those acts were signed into law and are not subject to increases for inflation. These thresholds can only be increased by Congress in the form of an amendment to the laws. While we are trying to maximize the use of the card through micropurchase processes because of the time and cost savings and potential refunds to be earned, FAR Subpart 13.201B tells us that the card shall be the preferred method to purchase and pay for micropurchases. A micropurchase being a purchase at or below the thresholds you see here. We walk through the basic definitions of construction services and supplies in the GSA SmartPay Purchase Essentials course as a starting point, but there's a lot of gray area around how to apply those definitions when it comes to real-life buying scenarios. There are statutory exemptions for purchase of certain services, and it can be very confusing on whether a service falls into the category of construction services or for the purposes of applying these thresholds in compliance with labor laws. When the MPT was lower and it was held at or just above these statutory exemptions, it wasn't as tricky and the stakes weren't as high. But as the MPT has increased well beyond the statutory exemptions, more guidance is needed to help AOPCs, many who are not formally trained in acquisition law processes, to be better able to define what's acquired and correctly apply those micro-purchase thresholds. Since the bulk of this course is making the decision about categorizing a purchase as either construction, service, or supply, we are primarily talking about when we use the purchase card as a procurement mechanism under FAR 13.301. For any open market purchase of any value, the government must make a determination prior to the purchase on how to classify the need. That's the product or service being purchased. And this is done to determine if the processes to be used to make the purchase, as dictated by FAR, are typically based on the definition of the need, or sometimes other policies come into play if we're not doing FAR-based transactions such as training, which we'll talk about later. It's also used to determine any applicable statutory exemptions and any additional requirements that must be met because of the determination, like any laws, labor laws, wage determinations, any requirements that we also need from the vendor. Using the card as a procurement mechanism means the cardholder is held to the MPTs we talked about on the previous page or their single purchase limit, whichever is lower. I've been asked many times, is it okay to have cardholders merely provide wage determinations if they want to use the card over these statutory limitations or over the lower micro-purchase thresholds for services and construction? The answer is no. Cardholders cannot use the purchase card over the micro-purchase threshold as a procurement mechanism on the open market, period. When using the purchase card as an ordering mechanism both over and under the micro-purchase threshold, it can only be used to order against existing contracts such as GSA schedules or some agency indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contracts. Existing contracts have already been classified as a service, construction, or supply, so there's no need to make that decision on how to categorize a purchase for orders when you're ordering under existing contracts. The terms and conditions of the existing contract will dictate if and how orders may be placed, by whom, and at what thresholds the purchase card may be used as an ordering mechanism. Over the micro-purchase threshold, only warranted contracting officers or duly appointed ordering officers may place those orders because of a variety of FAR requirements that exist, some which mandate contractors are granted fair opportunity for each order that's available. That's making sure every contractor that has a contract award receives a fair opportunity to compete for every order. Contracting officers and ordering officers have been trained in these processes, and they are aware of how to deal with these situations. When using the purchase card as a payment mechanism, transactions are not classified as construction, service, or supply because the card is not being used as the procurement instrument. A contract action has already been executed by other means, such as a formal contract, a purchase order, a task order, a delivery order, and the decision on how that purchase was classified has already been made. The single purchase limit and monthly purchase limits of the cardholder and the terms and conditions of the contract action are really what govern as to if the purchase card may be used for a payment mechanism. With these parameters in mind for today's discussion, let's walk through some questions to ask yourself when making the decision on how to define a need. In making the decision on how to categorize a purchase, we can start by asking ourselves, what is the primary need or purpose of this buy? What do you most hope to accomplish? Is it to build a boat dock? Is it to install cabling for better internet service? Is it to buy a trailer to haul equipment? If the work involves a combination of construction services and/or supplies, which is most important? Can the work be separated, or is it so merged or fragmented a distinction can't be made? What is the mix of work compared to the total price? Judgment must be used when answering these questions, and there is no hard, fast rule as to the precise meaning of primary purpose. While price should be considered in the primary purpose, it's rarely the defining factor. Don't merely equate percentages of work in terms of the total dollar value and say, well, I have a project where 70% of the cost is supplies and materials, and the rest of the cost is labor to perform a service, so I must have a supply buy. It's really not that simple. When asked which micro-purchase threshold applies when using the purchase card as a procurement mechanism, sometimes there can be a lot of gray area in that decision. We aren't always buying things that on the surface clearly fall into a category, particularly as the micro-purchase threshold increases or when applying a higher micro-purchase threshold in the case of contingency buying. The Center for Charge Card Management at GSA fields questions and helps agencies navigate how best to classify different purchases when it comes to the application of the appropriate micro-purchase threshold. However, we are not experts in every agency's procurement rules, so we will always recommend that you check with your own contracting experts and counsel for additional guidance. The general decision flow on this slide, along with a series of yes and no questions we will review in upcoming slides, can be used to provide guidance and assistance to cardholders. The decision flow and questions can also be used to help make sense of documentation that may be part of a transaction log when you're reviewing a purchase after the fact, such as in the case of a program review, audit, or fraud or case management adjudication. The decision flow can be used rather quickly to determine how to employ the micro-purchase threshold and possibly supporting documentation that needs to be collected as part of the purchase decision. It can also help identify when a buy may need to move to the contracting officer for purchase, and most importantly, how to avoid unauthorized commitments and ratification actions. When we start with the decision on how to define a need, it's easiest to compare your need to the definition of supplies first, then construction, and lastly services. Whatever doesn't fall into the first two categories, most often, but not always, falls into services. And we'll talk about those exceptions too. Let's get started with supplies. When it comes to determining how to classify a need into one of our categories, deciding if the need is a supply is the easiest place to start. The characteristics of items of supply are listed here. If it's a tangible item that can be overhauled, depreciated, repaired, thrown away, or disposed of, rebuilt, maintained, held in stock, salvaged, returned, recycled, classified as property, transported, touched, is off the shelf, or bought using a national stock number or through a distributor, then it's a supply. Supplies are things like materials, lumber, rock, or sand, equipment, software, hardware, accessories, and tools. Supplies can also be component parts that comprise an end item of supply, like memory cards, circuits, gears, nuts and bolts, bushings and housings, etc. FAR Subpart 2.101 defines supplies as all property except land or interest in land and the alteration or installation of the foregoing. Keeping in mind the primary purpose or intent of the work and the definition of supply, the first and easiest question to ask when looking at the primary purpose of a purchase is, will only end items of supply be provided by the vendor? If the answer is yes, the purchase falls into the category of supplies and the purchase card can be used at or below the micro-purchase threshold found in FAR 2.101. That's presently $10,000. If the answer is no, then we have to decide if the buy could still fall under the definition of supplies, and does the buy fall outside of supplies, and instead under the classification of construction or services. When buying end items of supply, such as a piece of large or heavy equipment, incidental services may exist and be associated in the receipt of that item. For example, generators or a set of heavy-duty batteries may need to be installed. Many times vendors will include the installation as part of the total price of the supply item. They may also include other things like setup, testing, or an hour with your staff to teach you how to run or operate equipment. If the services are specific to the installation of the supply item, the purchase card can be used at or below the micro-purchase threshold for supplies. If the services are part of the vendor's normal pricing and the type offered to the general public, this is acceptable, and the service portion of the work does not need to be separately priced. You do not need to ask the contractors to separately price the services if all-inclusive pricing is how they normally price their items. However, if the vendor prices incidental services separately, then there are a few things to consider. Are the services based on a published catalog or price list available for you to view? If not, can the prices or the services be substantiated through an independent source like comparable pricing of other vendors or the government's knowledge of the work? What should it cost? Are the services of the type offered to the general public as part of their normal business? Services should not be the primary purpose or intent of the work to remain classified as a supply. Determining a supply purchase is probably the simpler decision to make between our categories, but we have a case study to review later that may prove otherwise. The next category to consider in our decision flow is construction. Under this category, we must not only consider the characteristics of construction and the primary purpose of the work, but whether construction is part of non-construction efforts such as supply and services, and if there is incidental construction included in a supply or service buy. The difference between those two considerations is subtle but very important. As we discussed in the Purchase Essentials class, construction means construction, alteration, or repair, including dredging, excavating, and painting, involving buildings, structures, or other real property, and includes improvements of all types. Real property is defined in 41 CFR 102.71.20 as land together with the improvements, structures, and fixtures located thereon, including prefabricated movable structures under the control of any federal agency. FAR 22.401 makes the distinction that work on a building or work site generally indicates a construction activity, different from manufacturing, furnishing of materials, or servicing and maintenance work. The characteristics of construction include, but are not limited to, work that occurs on or in buildings, structures, work sites, or other real property, to include land and all improvements, structures, and fixtures thereon. It typically involves laborers or mechanics whose duties are manual or physical in nature, employed by a construction company, a subcontractor, or a typical type of contractor at a building or work site without limitations. Transportation of materials and supplies between work sites could also be considered construction, but this does not include solely delivery of materials or supplies to a site. Construction also involves public buildings and public works. A public building or public work means a building or the work, the construction, completion, or repair of which is carried out directly by the authority of or with the funds of a federal agency to serve the interest of the general public, regardless whether title is in the name of the federal agency or not. Construction may include dismantling, demolishing, and removing improvements, and may include remodeling, painting, and decorating of existing structures. Construction does not include assembling aircrafts and vessels, manufacturing, production, furnishing, alteration, repair, or processing of aircraft or vessels either. We know that the micro-purchase threshold for construction is set at $2,000 due to the need to enforce wage and fringe benefit floors through the wage determinations mandated by Department of Labor through the Construction Wage Rate Requirements Statute, again, formerly known as Davis-Bacon. FAR subparts 22401 and 22402 also say that for the purposes of applying construction wage rate requirements, construction, alteration, and repair means all the primary purposes of the work you see listed here on the left. If you can say yes to any of these questions when it comes to the primary purpose or intent of the work, it's considered construction. If the work is solely construction, not part of a service or supply buy, you can stop here and apply the micro-purchase threshold for construction to the buy. If there are services or supplies commingled with construction, then we have other considerations. Cardholders may not simply provide copies of Department of Wage Rates determinations to contractors performing work subject to construction wage rate requirements going over the micro-purchase threshold and call that good. There are statutes that kick in over that threshold for construction that require a lot of clauses to be included that cover things such as contract work hours and safety standards, convict labor, payroll and basic records, apprentices and trainees, subcontracts, and all sorts of applicable labor standards. This is why the use of the purchase card over the micro-purchase threshold for construction is again limited to trained, warranted contracting officers and duly appointed ordering officers. Non-construction buys may involve some construction work, even when construction is commingled with other requirements. If it's easily distinguishable and separate from the other known non-construction efforts, we must still be mindful of the micro-purchase threshold for construction. Ask yourself if the construction work is performed as part of non-construction efforts, such as supply or services, and is performed on a public building or work, and also is physically or functionally separate from or is capable of being performed on a segregated basis from the other work required. If the answer to all three of these questions is yes, then the purchase card should only be used if the construction portion of the work is less than the micro purchase threshold for construction. That would be less than $2,000 at present. And the total value of the purchase is equal to or less than the micro purchase threshold for the classification of non-construction efforts. That's either supplies at $10,000 or services at $2,500 for non-professional services and $10,000 for professional services. We'll get into those distinctions in a few more slides. Over the micro purchase threshold for construction, the purchase must be made again by a warranted contracting officer and include the construction wage rate requirements, wage determination, as well as other terms and conditions that are required by statute. In the case of buying services or large equipment as a supply, there may be instances where construction services are also required. To be truly incidental in its nature, construction work has to be limited to simple installation or alteration of a public building or public work that is required as part of furnishing the supplies or equipment under a supply contract. Or the incidental construction must be so merged with non-construction work or so fragmented in the terms and locations or time spans in which it is performed that it's not capable of being segregated as a separate requirement. In either case, the construction wage rate requirements do not apply and the micro purchase threshold for construction is not applicable. In this case, the purchase card can be used over the micro purchase threshold for construction up to and at the micro purchase threshold for supplies or services as applicable, depending on the primary purpose of the work. Now, some important notes to keep in mind here is the word substantial relates to the type and quantity of construction work to be performed and not merely the total value of the construction work as compared to the total value of the requirement. If incidental construction is deemed substantial and segregable, such in the case of installation of heavy generators or large refrigerator systems, like for plant modification or rearrangement, the 2,000 micro purchase threshold applies for that portion of the work. When work is so commingled between construction and any other item like service, supplies, or research and development, it is always wise to consult the contracting officer and legal counsel at your agency for assistance. Incidental construction is one of the many gray areas mentioned early that we must work within. Ask questions when you find yourself in the gray area. Using FAR and agency policies and procedures and other advice from acquisition experts, document your decision and either make or don't make the purchase. It takes a little effort, but doing the work up front and having a process to run these types of things through your acquisition and legal experts saves a lot of grief later at audit time. The last category to consider in our decision flow is services. Under this category, we must not only consider the characteristics of services and the primary purposes of the work, but the statutory exemption for certain services, whether the services are personal versus non-personal in nature, and if the work will be performed by professional or non-professional personnel, or a combination thereof. A service has certain characteristics that make it so. A service is defined as a discrete task, hours, or specific effort. It's not off the shelf. It can be a solution or an idea. Services may not have a tangible end item or deliverable. Services can also be performed on an end item of supply already owned by the government, such as a maintenance service. Services are not ordered by a part number and are not capable of being duplicated identically. Services can be written, such as documents, reports, and presentations, or oral, such as advice, technical expertise, and counsel. The word service is a noun. It's the action of doing work for someone. And it's also a verb, having your car serviced, for example. Services are things like documents, advice, reports, innovative solutions, or performing according to a process. It's an effort. In the Purchase Essentials class, we discuss that services are defined as directly engaging the time and effort of a contractor whose primary purpose is to perform a task rather than furnish an end item of supply. We talked about dismantling, demo, and removal of improvements under the definition of construction on that previous slide. There is a caveat on that slide, however, that those efforts are only construction when there is a follow-on construction contract at the same site. You'll notice here that there is no follow-on construction at the same site, and when that's the case, dismantling, demo, and removal now become a service. So that's something to keep in mind when you have that type of work. Services include the maintenance of real property, such as janitorial services, and things like elevator maintenance, though elevator modernization is not an improvement, is an improvement and would be considered construction. My apologies there. Routine installation support services, transportation of freight and personnel, and communications are also services. However, as we touched on also in the construction slide, the definition of painting is based on total square feet, not dollar value. If painting is less than 200 square feet or less than 32 hours in duration and not part of a construction project, it's standalone. Let's say you're going to paint an office for an incoming dignitary. It's considered services and subject to the micro purchase threshold for services, which is $2,500, but considered construction if it goes over that 200 square feet or 32 hours in duration, regardless of the price. Services are also either non-personal or personal and can be performed by either professional or non-professional personnel, both individually or on an organizational basis. FAR Subpart 22 1003-1 says that service contract labor standards apply to all services over the micro purchase threshold except as exempted in FAR 22 1003-3 and 1003-4. They are applicable only to those services performed in the United States. Exempted services are typically offered and sold regularly and provided by the contractor to the general public on a commercial basis in substantial quantities as part of the contractor's normal business operation. Prices for exempted services are based on established and regularly maintained catalog or market prices and are either published or available for inspection to customers. Services that are exempted from the service contract labor standards by statute include transport of freight or personnel where tariff rates are in effect or on regularly scheduled routes or via commercial services. This does not include charter services. And note, this exemption typically does not apply to contracts for ambulance or taxi cab services because they are not deemed common carriers or governed by published tariff rates. Also exempt are services subject to the Communications Act of 1934, such as radio, telephone, or cable companies. Public utility services are exempt. Employment contracts providing direct services to a federal agency by an individual or individuals are also exempt, and any services performed outside the United States or its territories are also exempt. The Secretary of Labor may provide reasonable limitations and may make rules and regulations allowing reasonable variations, tolerance, and exceptions to and from any or all provisions of the Service Contract Labor Standards Statute except for wage and fringe benefit determinations only in special circumstances. Those circumstances are where the Secretary determines that the limitation, variance, tolerance, or exemption is necessary and proper in the public interest or to avoid a serious impairment of federal government business, and such action would protect prevailing labor standards. So in addition to statutory exemptions on our previous slide, what all this means to you is that FAR 22.1003-4 includes a list of administrative limitations, variances, tolerances, and exemptions provided for by the Secretary of Labor. Those regulatory exemptions from the Service Contract Act include what you see on this slide. Things like shipping by common carrier when the government packs the item for a company like UPS or FedEx to pick up and ship. Now, this does not include shipping as part of a supply purchase. Shipping by itself, if not under one of these exemptions shown, is a service subject to the Service Contract Labor Standards and the lower micro purchase threshold for services. One of the regulatory exemptions is also maintenance, calibration, or repair of certain equipment. And this equipment is specifically defined in FAR as ADP, Office, and word processing systems, scientific equipment and medical apparatus or equipment if the application of microelectrocircuitry or other technology of at least similar sophistication is an essential element, and office business machines when services are performed by the manufacturer or supplier of that equipment. Another exemption is automotive fleet of vehicles. When we talk about automotive, it's fleet of vehicles or other vehicles such as aircraft, normal maintenance services, other than contracts to operate a motor pool. So this would be maintenance outside of operation of a government motor pool. Financial services involving the issuance and servicing of cards and card services is exempt. So actually, our GSA SmartPay contracts are exempt from the service contract labor standards. Hotel and motel services for conferences of a limited duration, defined as 1 to 5 days, that could include lodging, meals, and space such as conference rooms as part of the contract. Real estate services, including real property appraisal services related to housing, federal agencies, or disposing of real property owned by the government. Transportation by common carrier of persons by air, motor vehicle, rail, marine vessel on regularly scheduled routes or via standard commercial services. Relocation services for the move of military and civilian personnel and their families, including real estate brokers and appraisers. And parking spaces. When purchasing services, cardholders need to be aware of the limitations on the purchase of personal services. So let's talk about the difference between non-personal and personal services. Non-personal services are services where the personnel rendering the services are not subject either by the terms or the manner of its administration to the supervision and control of the government and does not create a prevailing relationship between the government and its employees. The work is performed independently by the contractor to include oversight and management of the work assignments, quality, and contractor personnel. Personal services, however, are characterized by a creation of an employer-employee relationship between the government and the contractor's personnel, either through the terms of the requirements or the way the work is administered. Placing an order for a specific article or service that includes the right to reject the finished product or result is not the type of supervision or control that converts an individual who is an independent contractor into a government employee. Therefore, that type of rejection of a finished product or result does not create an employer-employee relationship. Only agencies authorized by 5 U.S.C. 3109 may buy personal services. If provided a specific statutory authority to make a purchase of personal services, it's highly recommended that a review and opinion of legal counsel be obtained before you complete such a purchase using the card. You can see FAR Subpart 37-103A 1 through 3 for guidance on obtaining legal counsel, and that site is in the reference material that you'll receive. The government is normally required to obtain its employees by direct hire under competitive appointment or other procedures required by civil service laws. Obtaining personal services by contract rather than by direct hire circumvents those laws unless Congress has specifically authorized an acquisition of such services to an agency. If an agency is authorized under 5 U.S.C. 3109 to purchase personal services, it must limit those services to an intermittent basis or temporary not to exceed 1 year and submit an annual report to OPM with the number of days the contractor was employed and the full amount paid during the period. So you can see there are certain limitations, and what we don't want to do with the purchase card is to get involved with circumventing hiring authorities by the use of the card. So that's really important to keep in mind, these differences between non-personal and personal services. There are key questions to determine if a service is personal in nature or not. When it comes to personal services, judgment should be made on a case-by-case basis. The key question is, will the government exercise relatively continuous supervision and control over the contractor personnel performing the contract? Sporadic, unauthorized supervision might reasonably be considered not relevant, while continuous government supervision is relevant. So FAR Subpart 37-104D lists the descriptive elements that should be used as a guide in assessing whether or not a service is personal in nature. And as I read through these, you can see many of them are on the screen here on the left-hand side, but some of those are, is performance completed on site? Are principal tools and equipment furnished by the government? Are services applied directly to the integral effort of agencies or an organizational subpart in furtherance of an assigned mission or function? Are comparable services meeting comparable needs performed in the same or similar agency using civil service personnel? The need for the type of services provided reasonably can be expected to last beyond a year, and the inherent nature of the service or the manner in which it is provided reasonably requires direct or indirect government direction or supervision of contractor employees in order to adequately protect the government's interests, retain control of the function involved, or retain full personal responsibility for the function supported in a duly authorized federal officer or employee. Personal services of individual experts or consultants are limited by the Classification Act, and the Office of Personnel Management has established requirements which apply in acquiring personal services of experts or consultants in this manner. It pertains to things like benefits, taxes, the need to disclose conflicts of interest, etc. Therefore, the cardholder and the AOPC should coordinate with their legal counsel and the cognizant civilian personnel office before completing such a purchase. When it comes to temporary help, you'll see at the bottom, private sector temporary help is considered non-personal per subpart 37.112. The government can make purchases from temporary help service firms for the brief or intermittent use of skills of private sector temporaries. Services of this type are not regarded or treated as personal services and shall not be used in lieu of regular recruitment under civil service laws or to displace a federal employee. Prior to purchasing temp services, however, agencies must ensure they have authority under and meet the criteria and conditions of 5 CFR Part 300 Subpart E, use of private sector temporaries, as well as meet all agency requirements and follow agency procedures. We've already talked about classifications of services that are exempt from the service contract labor standards, either by statute or regulation. However, services may also be exempt from the service contract labor standards based on the services performed and the classification of the personnel who perform the work. The service contract labor standards define service employees as persons engaged in the performance of a covered contract, except those persons who individually qualify for a Fair Labor Standards Act exemption as a bona fide executive, administrative, or professional employee. Those are defined in 29 CFR 451. There are also exemptions for computer employees and certain highly compensated employees. Now, one thing to note here is non-management maintenance employees, such as carpenters, electricians, mechanics, plumbers, ironworkers, craftsmen, operating engineers, longshoremen, and other similar laborers, are not exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act, no matter how highly they may be paid. So when we're talking about the exemptions and the test for salary as we move on through the slides, please keep that in mind. What this means to you is if the service is being performed and the personnel performing the work are individually exempt under the Fair Labor Standards Act, services up to the overall micro purchase threshold of $10,000 may be purchased with the card. So it gives you the wiggle room to move from $2,500, which is the normal service contract labor standards threshold for services, up to $10,000 for your purchases. And we're going to talk specifically about the classifications and the type of work and the personnel that perform them and how they're considered professional or non-professional. And you can see here on this slide, the Fair Labor Standards Act, or 29 U.S.C. 201, prescribes standards for the minimum basic wage and overtime pay that affects the service contract labor standards covered actions. So the two actions, the Fair Labor Standards Act and the service contract labor standards, intersect in three ways. In the three ways are listed here on the screen. The first is that the service contract labor standard provides that no contractor or sub shall pay any employee engaged in performing work on a covered contract less than the minimum specified under the Fair Labor Standards Act. The second way it intersects is where we talked about the definition of a service employee and those engaged in the performance of a contract or portion of a work, except those that are in the bona fide executive, administrative, or professional capacities. And those terms are defined in the Fair Labor Standards Act regulation. And lastly, the Service Contract Labor Standards intersects with the Fair Labor Standards Act in terms of overtime compensation to be paid for service employees working in connection with contracts that are subject to the Service Contract Labor Standards. So we're, for the purposes of today, going to concentrate on the definitions of bona fide executive, administrative, and professional employee, what you see bold there in the center column. So let's talk about each of those now. So professional services are classified as such because the primary duty is the performance of work by persons requiring knowledge of an advanced type in a field of science or learning, customarily acquired by a prolonged course of specialized intellectual instruction, or the performance of work requiring invention, imagination, originality, or talent in a recognized field of artistic or creative endeavor. These are professions such as architects, engineers, archaeologists, chemists, biologists, accountants, lawyers, doctors of medicine or dentistry, actuaries, physicists, computer systems analysts, computer programmers, software engineers, and other similarly skilled computer workers or instructors of the same. All these are considered to provide professional services. To be considered professional services, we don't look at only the work to be performed, but who performs it. Persons performing professional services must do so customarily and regularly as part of their primary duties, meaning that the professional services occur normally as part of their primary duties and recur every work week. Professional services cannot be performed isolated or one-time tasks to receive the exemption. For the purposes of determining the exemption from the service contract labor standards as a professional service, the profession must be considered exempt under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Exemption from the Fair Labor Standards Act means that the employee doing the work is not subject to a minimum wage and overtime requirements and is employed as a bona fide executive, administrative, or professional capacity. Per the Code of Federal Regulations, 20 CFR Part 541, job titles alone are not sufficient to establish the exemption status. The exempt or non-exempt status is determined on the basis of whether the salary and the duties of the person doing the work meet the requirements therein. So what does this mean when you're purchasing services? If the work will be performed solely by a personnel who falls within the bounds of professional services, then you may exceed the micro purchase threshold exemption of $2,500 for services covered by the service contract labor standards, but not exceed the micro purchase threshold of $10,000. So again, it gives you the wiggle room to move between $2,500 in terms of the value of your purchase up to $10,000. If only part of the work falls within the bounds of professional services, there are other considerations, and I have that covered on a later slide. But when in doubt, again, I'm always going to say, seek the advice of an acquisition expert like a contracting officer or legal counsel, ideally your agency's labor or wage attorney, if the work does not clearly fall into the categories you see here. Now let's walk through the definitions of each Fair Labor Standards Act individual exemption so that there's a little more clarity for you. The term employee employed in a bona fide executive capacity is defined in the Fair Labor Standards Act, and it means any employee compensated on a salary basis at a rate of not less than $684 per week. You can see there's another salary per week for work outside the continental United States, and this is exclusive of board, lodging, or other facilities. It also means any employee whose primary duty is management of the enterprise in which the employee is employed, or of a customarily recognized department or subdivision thereof. So let's say a department director or a subdivision director. It's also an employee who's customarily and regularly directs the work of two or more employees and who has the authority to hire or fire other employees, or whose suggestions and recommendations as to hiring and firing, advancement, promotion, or other change of status of other employees is given significant weight. Now, the phrases such as salary basis, board, lodging, or other facilities, primary duty, and customarily and regularly is defined in the CFR sites, which you'll find in the handouts. Some examples of management duties include selecting, training, appraising, and disciplining employees, planning and apportioning work, determining technical and/or materials to be used, purchased, stocked, or sold, planning and controlling budgets, and monitoring performance. Now, for a business owner to qualify as a bona fide executive, they have to own at least 20% interest in the organization in which they are employed, regardless of the organization of the business. So regardless whether it's a corporation, a partnership, etc. And the business owner must be actively engaged in its management in order for this exemption to apply as well. The term employee employed in a bona fide administrative capacity is also outlined in the Act, and that means any employee who's compensated on a salary or fee basis pursuant to a rate of not less than $684 per week. Again, you see the other exemption, whose primary duty is the performance of office or non-manual work directly related to the management or general business operations of the employer or employer's customers, and whose primary duty includes the exercise of discretion and independent judgment with respect to matters of significance. Functional areas for administrative employees include tax, finance, accounting, budget, auditing, insurance, quality control, purchasing, procurement, advertising, marketing, research, safety and health, personnel management, human resources, employee benefits, labor relations, internet database management, legal and regulatory compliance, computer networks, and similar activities and advisors and consultants thereof. The phrase discretion and independent judgment must be applied in light of all the facts involved in the particular employment situation in which this question arises. So, factors to consider when determining whether an employee exercises judgment and independent discretion with respect to matters of significance include, but are not limited to, whether the employee has authority to formulate, affect, interpret, or implement management policies and practices, whether they carry out major assignments to conduct operations of the business, whether that work affects business operations to a substantial degree, whether that employee has authority to commit the employer in matters that have significant financial impact, like signing contracts, or if they have the authority to waive or deviate from established business policies and procedures without approval. An administrative employee also must have the authority to negotiate and bind the company on significant matters, provide consultation or expert advice to the management is involved in planning or long-term business objectives, investigates and resolves matters of significance on behalf of management, and also can represent the company in handling complaints, arbitrating disputes, or resolving grievances. So when you see we're talking about administrative capacity, it's not in the terms of, let's say, an administrative tech, for example. The exercise of discretion and independent judgment implies that the employee has authority to make an independent choice free of immediate direction or supervision. However, those employees can exercise discretion and independent judgment even if those decisions must be reviewed at a higher level. So that's a little confusing maybe, but again, the outcome of all that and all those bullets will be in the materials that will help you define better what a person in an administrative capacity is defined as. The term employee employed in a bona fide capacity, a professional capacity, excuse me, is again the same compensation. The primary duty of the work is requiring knowledge of an advanced type in a field of science or learning, customarily acquired by a prolonged course of specialized intellectual instruction, or requiring invention, imagination, originality, and talent in a recognized field of artistic or creative endeavor. The work requiring advanced knowledge means work which is predominantly intellectual in nature and which includes work requiring the consistent exercise of discretion and judgment as distinguished from performance of routine mental, manual, mechanical, or physical work. An employee who performs work requiring advanced knowledge generally uses the advanced knowledge to analyze, interpret, make deductions from varying facts or circumstances, and advanced knowledge cannot be attained at the high school level. The phrase field of science and learning includes the traditional professions of law, medicine, theology, accounting, etc., and is distinguished from the mechanical arts or skilled trades, where in some instances the knowledge is of fairly advanced type, but is not in a field of science or learning. Now, the phrase customarily acquired by prolonged course of specialized intellectual instruction restricts the exemption to professions where you must have specialized academic training as a standard or prerequisite to enter the profession. So the best initial evidence that an employee meets the requirement is the possession of an appropriate academic degree. However, the word customarily means that the exemption is also available to employees in such professions who have substantially the same knowledge level and perform substantially the same work as a degreed employee, but who obtain their advanced knowledge through a combination of work experience and instruction. The learned professional exemption is not available for occupations that customarily may be performed with only the general knowledge acquired by an academic degree in any field, with knowledge acquired through an internship or with training in the performance of routine mental, manual, mechanical, or physical processes. So this means that the learned professional exemption does not apply to occupations in which most employees have acquired their skill by experience rather than by advanced specialized intellectual instruction. Now, when it comes to the creative professionals exemption that falls under this category as the professional category in the FLSA, to qualify for the creative professional exemption, an employee's primary duty must be the performance of work that requires invention, imagination, originality, or talent. This does not apply to work which can be produced by a person with general manual or intellectual ability and training. To qualify for this exemption, the work must be in a recognized field of artistic and creative endeavor. That's music, writing, acting, and graphic arts. This requirement is generally met by actors, musicians, composers, conductors, soloists, painters, etc., essayists, novelists, short story writers, etc., and those persons that hold more responsible writing positions in, let's say, advertising agencies, where this is where the creative professionals exemption may come into play most often in government purchasing. Now, some may ask if teachers, when we're having somebody come in and teach a class, per se, falls under the professional exemption, and it may. The term employee employed in a bona fide professional capacity also means an employee with a primary duty of teaching, tutoring, instructing, or lecturing in the activity of imparting knowledge, and who is employed and engaged in this activity as a teacher in an educational establishment by which they're employed. So that is the difference. Those people include but not limited to regular academic teachers, teachers of skilled and semi-skilled trades and occupations, and teachers engaged in automobile driving instruction, aircraft flight instructors, etc., which also has come into play in government purchasing. I know when I worked at FAA, we did buy some of those services from flight instructors. Teachers also usually possess a teaching certificate to qualify for the exemption, regardless of the terminology used by their state to differentiate between that type of certification. And the requirements of the salary in subpart G of this part don't apply to teaching professions. The salary requirements are exempt. This is the same for the practice of law or medicine. The holder must have a valid license or certificate permitting the practice of law or medicine in their branch, and must be actually engaged in the practice of law or medicine. The salary requirements also do not apply to lawyers or medical professionals. The last FLSA example that we're going to talk about is computer system analysts, computer programmers, and software engineers, or other similarly skilled workers in the computer field. They are eligible for exemption as professionals under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Because job titles vary widely and change quickly in the computer industry, job titles are not determinative of the applicability of the exemption. The section in the Fair Labor Standards Act applies to any computer employee who's compensated on a salary or fee basis at the rate of not less than $684 per week, or not less than $27.63 an hour. The exemptions apply only to computer employees whose primary duties consist of the application of systems analysis techniques and procedures, including consulting with users to determine hardware, software, or system functionality specifications, design, development, documentation, analysis, creation, testing, and modification of computer systems, and the design, documentation, testing, creation, or modification of computer programs related to machine operating systems, or a combination of all those above, as you see listed on the slide, which requires the same level of skills. The exemption for employees in computer occupations does not include employees engaged in the manufacture or repair of computer hardware or related equipment. Those employees' work is highly dependent upon and facilitated by the use of computers and computer software programs, such as engineers, drafters, or other skilled computer-aided design software personnel. Those are all outlined and identified in CFR 541 400B, 29 CFR 541 400B under the Fair Labor Standards Act, and you can see those definitions and cites in the materials you'll have. Computer employees within the scope of this exemption, as well as those employees not within its scope, may have executive and administrative duties, which could qualify them for exemption under the bona fide executive or professional definitions. So for examples, a systems analyst and computer programmer generally meet the duty requirements for the administrative exemption, if their duty includes the work such as planning, scheduling, coordinating activities required to develop systems and solve complex business, scientific, or engineering problems. Similarly, a senior or lead computer program who manages the work of 2 or more programmers in a department or subdivision could have the exemption for the executive. So you can see that does cross exemptions in this case, and it is knowing the understanding of what the employee is performing and the duties they're doing that will let you know which field of these 4 that we've talked about, which the exemptions they fall into. So here's a quick rundown that shows a few types of learned professionals and what the Fair Labor Standards Act says as to whether or not they are considered exempt from the Fair Labor Standards, ergo the service contract labor standards and the lower $2,500 micro purchase threshold. So to qualify for the exemption, the employee's primary duty has to be that performance of the exempt work like we talked about. And the term primary duty means that principal, major, main, or most important duty that they perform over 50% of their time. So running down this list quickly, the account clerk or bookkeeper performs routine work and does not typically require a 4-year or advanced degree. Now, certified public accountants generally meet the duties or requirements of the learned professional exception. In addition, many other accountants who are not CPAs but perform similar job duties may qualify. However, clerks, bookkeepers, and other employees who normally perform a great deal of routine work don't qualify for this exemption. Paralegals and legal assistants on an advanced degree are typically not required for entry into that field. However, some paralegals possess a 4-year degree or training. Unless the paralegal or legal assistants possess that advanced degree, they are not going to qualify for the FLSA exemption and they will be considered non-professional. Computer analysts, the primary duties that consist of an advanced knowledge or application of systems analysis techniques and procedures. We talked about that falling into the professional category. Same with hardware and software engineers. Interpreters are typically considered non-professional. An advanced degree is not typically required for entry into this field, but could be necessary if there is a certain type of interpretation being done, such as a linguist who also does interpretation. Stenographers are considered non-professional and do not qualify for the FLSA exemption. Now, consultants and advisors are a little tricky. This goes back to our definitions of professional services. It depends on the work and who performs the work. Merely calling oneself a title such as consultant or advisor does not confer advanced knowledge gained from a prolonged course of intellectual study, and it does not automatically trigger the exemption which classifies services as professional or non-professional. You must review those services on a case-by-case basis and classify those appropriately based on the information that I've just presented about the Service Contract Labor Standards and the Fair Labor Standards Act exemptions. Now, law enforcement, emergency response, and rescue personnel exemptions do not apply for the Fair Labor Standards Act, so those personnel are considered non-professional. And there is a lengthy discussion as to why, even if they are supervisors of other police officers or firefighters, if they oversee the work of, let's say, conducting investigations at crime scenes, et cetera, as to why they still are not considered professional services. So I would encourage you to read that. It's almost a page in length and quite lengthy to discuss here, but just know that law enforcement, emergency response, and rescue personnel are considered non-professional services for the purposes of applying the Fair Labor Standards Act exemption. Again, however, I'm going to always say this when it comes to these types of determinations: consult your agency labor advisor and legal counsel, contracting officer, any of those experts to help you make a proper determination when you have these types of purchases, should they come up for your purchase card. Now, what happens if you have a mix of professional and non-professional services? It comes down to how much of the non-professional work in terms of dollars, not percentages, is being performed. So if the non-professional services do not exceed $2,500, you can purchase the services up to the full micro purchase threshold of $10,000. If the professional services exceed $2,500, regardless of the aggregate value of the professional services, the lower micro purchase threshold of $2,500 applies. Examples are provided on this slide. Obtaining the information that you need to make this determination is typically the responsibility of the requester at most agencies, not the cardholder's responsibility to obtain. Your cardholders should be given this type of information, and it should be made available when there's a doubt about the types of services that will be purchased, whether professional or non-professional, and that is necessary in order for the cardholder to determine the appropriate micro purchase to apply. It's really not on the cardholder to find this information and have to seek that down and get that in order to make the proper application of the micro purchase threshold. So now that we've covered supplies, construction, and services, let's move on to some case studies to illustrate the rest of what we're going to cover today in our training. The case studies we will cover are actual purchases made by AOPCs at various levels within agencies and organizations who were seeking assistance about the classification of a purchase. In our first case study, a cardholder receives a request to purchase batteries and cables along with a transmitter, extender, and receiver capable of extending multi-channel audio signals up to 70 meters at a total price of $9,983. The cardholder is new to his office, and his supervisor asks him to fully utilize his newly increased single purchase limit of $10,000 to the max extent possible for any requests he receives. The requester is arguing the services or installation of an end item of supply and that the $10,000 micro purchase threshold applies. But the cardholder notices labor as an itemized cost for this effort and has concerns. So he is seeking your input about how to classify the work and which micro purchase threshold to apply. The vendor's quote is provided as shown on this slide. So where do we begin? First, let's take a look at the information from the requester and the quote so we understand the primary purpose or need. The requester indicated that the same work was performed 2 years ago in another office in the region, and the intended outcome, which we would call the primary purpose, is a solution to extend multi-channel relays for audio signals in the office. The supplies, if they were purchased separately, cannot be installed by government personnel. The quote is itemized and contains 2 lines for labor, application systems analyst and programmer, totaling $2,972.70, and the communications installer, totaling $4,787.15. The labor is approximately 78% of the total price, and supplies and miscellaneous materials comprise the remaining 22% of the price. When talking to the requester, he insisted the services are incidental to the purchase of the batteries, cable, and other supplies. So let's follow our decision flow to determine what we really have going on with this quote and the primary purpose or intent. In this case, the work can be separated clearly between the services and supplies needed. It is not so merged or fragmented that a distinction cannot be made. Could the services be considered incidental to the supply purchase? Well, the amount of the services alone does not indicate the type of purchase. In this case, the labor is separately priced and appears to be of the type generally offered to the public. However, the requester indicated that the work is meant to provide a solution to ongoing issues with multi-channel signal relays, or our primary purpose and intent of the purchase. Now we're going to look at the test for supplies as you see on this slide. The quote included both end items of supply and services, such as the labor for installation. We are not buying only the end item of supply. Therefore, the answer to our first test for supplies, will only end items of supply be provided by the vendor, as we saw in slide 8, is no. Since we have services, we must then decide if we have incidental services as part of a supply purchase. We must ask, are the services specifically for the installation of the supply item? Our answer here is yes, but in part. We have one line item that reads labor for a communications installer, but we still have to consider the services provided in the line labor application systems analyst, programmer, senior. For that labor, we must ask each of the questions below. Are the services priced as part of the quote either included in the price for the end item supply? Our answer here is no. Or are the prices based on a published catalog or list price available for inspection? In this situation, it was also no. Our last question is the labor as part of the quote substantiated through independent sources, such as it can be comparable with other prices of other vendors for same or similar work, or our knowledge of the work. In this case, it was yes. In addition, we must also determine if the services are the type offered to the public in general. The answer is yes. And are the services the primary purpose or intent of the work? No. The requester indicated that the work is meant to provide a solution to ongoing issues with multi-channel signal relays. The labor application systems analyst programmer is not involved in installation, and their role is to analyze the output of the installed supplies and optimize the existing system to maximize the multi-channel signal relays. So that's not part of primarily the installation of the supply. While the amount of the services alone does not dictate the type of the purchase, in this case, the labor is separately priced or segregable, and the primary purpose and intent of the purchase is to provide a solution which is a characteristic of a service. Keeping the primary purpose in mind, which is the solution, because the services are only in part for the installation of the supply item, the work is not supplies or supplies with incidental services. And for this reason, we must continue on with the tests for construction and services. Next, we will test for construction. On slide 12, you can see our decision flow is shown here. And we ask the questions: does the work construct, alter, repair, or improve real property? Does it include remodeling, painting, or decorating? Is there any dismantling, demolition, or removal of improvements involved? And does the work involve labor or mechanics whose duties are manual or physical in nature, employed by a construction company, sub, or similar type of contractor at a building or work site? In this case, the answer to all these questions is no. And as a result, we know we don't have construction or supplies with incidental construction. This means our next and last decisions involve services. As found on slide 17, we start the decision flow process by asking, does the work engage the time or effort of a contractor whose primary purpose is to perform a task or provide a solution? The answer to this is yes. This confirms our earlier question about primary purpose. Answers to the remaining questions are no. I would like you to note that the bullet, does the work provide communication services, is answered as no. And this is because there's a statutory exemption in FAR subpart 22-1003-3 that we talked about earlier for furnishing services by radio, telephone, or cable companies subject to the Communications Act. The work in this case, however, is not provided by such a company. That's why the answer is no. You can see the rest of the questions on the left-hand side that we've answered as no. Now let's move to the left-hand side. Does the work fall under a statutory or regulatory exemption from the service contract labor standards? The work here is not one of the listed statutory or regulatory exemptions, so it is not excluded from the service contract labor standards based on the statute. We then need to ask, is the work personal or non-personal? Is an employer-employee relationship established between the vendor and the government by either the work itself or the nature in which it will be administered? In this case, no. So we know we don't have personal services. We have non-personal services. Is the work considered professional or non-professional? Well, we have one labor category that is an application system analyst and programmer, which falls under the classification of professional services as a computer employee and exceeds the hourly threshold of the $27.63 an hour. The quoted rate here is $110.10 an hour. However, we can't forget that we also have the other category that's a communications installer, and that is $4,787.15 of the total price, or 48%. That service, that work performed by that employee is not considered professional services and is covered by the service contract labor standards. So the work is not solely performed by individuals that fall within the professional services exemption as provided for under the Fair Labor Standards Act. So let's look at our solution to this question. Based on our answers, we can see that the test for supplies shows that installation services are only partially for installation of the supply item and do not fit the test for supplies with incidental services. The test for construction shows us we do not have construction by definition. And the test for services shows us that a solution is a characteristic of a service. The work does not meet a statutory or regulatory exemption, and the services are only partially performed by a bona fide professional, the computer employee. So the exemption in the Fair Labor Standards Act does not apply. Therefore, we can determine that the need is a service subject to the service contract labor standards and the lower micro-purchase threshold of $2,500. Since the total price for this action is $9,983, the cardholder cannot make this purchase using the purchase card because it exceeds the micro-purchase threshold of $2,500 for services, and that's non-professional services. The action should be forwarded to the contracting office for further processing. Let's look at another case study. This time we will decide if a need is classified as a construction or not, in this case, we have a concrete pad that's needed for testing as part of a research and development project, and the cost is $2,200 inclusive of labor and materials. The concrete pad will be destroyed in 2 years after testing is completed. The cardholder believes the work is a service and the purchase can be made up to the $2,500 micro-purchase threshold for services, but his approving official isn't so sure and wants your opinion. So where do we begin? Again, let's take a look at the email that we've been provided so we can understand the work better. The requester indicated that an 8x8 concrete pad should be centered in the south quadrant and provided specifications and distances for the placement. The requester indicated that the pad is for testing and will be removed by government personnel in 2 years once testing is complete. The price is all inclusive of labor and materials at $2,200, which is $200 over the micro-purchase threshold for construction, currently set at $2,000, but it's $300 under the services micro-purchase threshold for non-professional services, which is currently $2,500. The pad must be completed by June 15th of 2021. So let's start our test questions. In this case, we are not purchasing an end item of supply. While materials are part of this purchase, the materials are not the primary purpose or intent of the buy. Our answers to all the questions for supplies are no. Therefore, we do not have a supply purchase. Next, we test for construction. Does the work construct, alter, repair, or improve real property? In this case, no. The definition of construction is construction, alteration, or repair, including dredging, excavating, and painting of buildings, structures, or other real property, and includes improvements of all types. The concrete pad is not construction, alteration, or repair of real property, which is defined as land, together with improvements, structures, and fixtures located thereon. The temporary concrete pad is not an appreciable improvement to real property. So let's ask the next questions. Does it include remodeling, painting, or decorating? No. Is there any dismantling, demolition, or removal of improvements involved in this purchase? No. That will be done at a later time by government personnel. Does the work involve laborers or mechanics whose duties are manual or physical in nature, employed by a construction company, sub, or other similar type of contractor at a building or work site? In this case, the answer is no. While laborers may be involved and employed by a similar type of contractor, they are not being employed at a building or work site. In 29 CFR 5.2I, such efforts on a building or a work site, which is classified as a building, road, bridge, railway, sewer, subway, pump station, canal, levee, etc., generally indicates a construction activity. In 29 CFR 5.1 item L and the Department of Labor Field Office Handbook, Chapter 15, the site of the work is determined to be the physical place or places where the building or work called for in the contract will remain, and any other site where a significant portion of the building or work is construction, provided that that site is established specifically for the performance of the contract or the project. It is not anywhere the work is performed. In this case, the pad is not part of a building or work because the site is not established specifically for the performance of this contract or project. In this case, the answer to all these questions for construction is no. And as a result, we know we don't have construction or supplies with incidental construction. This means our next and last decisions involve services. When it comes to the test for services, we ask these questions again. Does the work engage the time or effort of a contractor whose primary purpose is to perform a task or provide a solution? The answer is yes. So this confirms our earlier question about the primary purpose. Answers to the remaining questions on the left-hand side are no, to things such as services for maintenance and repair of real property or government equipment and systems. We ask again, does the work fall under a statutory or regulatory exemption from the service contract labor standards? The answer is no. The work is not one of the listed statutory or regulatory exemptions, so it is not excluded from the service contract labor standards based on the statute. Is the work personal or non-personal in nature? Is an employer-employee relationship established? No, we know then that we have non-personal services. Is the work considered professional or non-professional? The work is non-professional. Done by service, none of the services are performed by bona fide executive, administrative, professional, or computer employees. The services are therefore covered by the service contract labor standards and subject to the lower $2,500 micro-purchase threshold. So looking at our solution for this case study based on our answers, the test for supplies is simple. We are not asking the vendor to provide end items of supply. The tests for construction show us that we do not have construction by definition. The work is not construction, alteration, or repair of real property. And while the work may be performed by laborers, they are not being employed at a building or work site, generally indicating a construction activity. The site of the work was not established specifically for the performance of this contract or project. The tests for services show us that the work meets the characteristic of a service, though it does not meet regulatory or statutory exemptions, and the services are not performed by bona fide executive, administrative, or professional personnel, so the Fair Labor Standards Act and Service Contract Labor Standard exemptions do not apply. Therefore, we can determine that the need is a service subject to the Service Contract Labor Standards and the lower micro-purchase threshold of $2,500. Since the total price of this action is $2,200, the cardholder can make this purchase using the purchase card because it does not exceed the micro-purchase threshold of $2,500 for services that are non-professional. But could this case study be argued another way as construction and maybe not services? Well, that's possible. There are types of decisions where the tolerances of your agency policies and processes come into play depending on the specifics of the project. What if the concrete pad was not going to be demolished? Or what if the pad was closer to the building and the plan was to use it later as a slab foundation to construct a prefab storage shed? Usually, in the case of construction, there is time to ask questions of your legal counsel and contracting office before you go it alone. Take that extra time. It's very prudent and often necessary. Now for our third case study. A government facility needs a door replaced. The requester had the cardholder purchase a large metal and glass double door last month without installation, assuming that the base operation and maintenance contractor could perform the work and save the government some money. However, the contracting officer's representative overseeing the O&M contractor has indicated the work doesn't fall within the scope of their contract. The requester has now brought the cardholder an email from the contractor saying that they are willing to do the work as a separate transaction if the government would like to use its purchase card. The O&M contractor quoted a flat price of $2,125 for installation. The cardholder called the AOPC concerned that she will not be able to make the purchase because the price exceeds the micro-purchase threshold for construction. So where do you begin? Let's again ask ourselves a series of test questions that determine the primary purpose or intent. Looking at our first test for supplies, the quote includes only installation. We are not buying only an end item of supply. Therefore, the answer to our first test questions are no. We do have installation services specific to an end item of supply, but the supply item in question was purchased separately. Since we have services with no end items of supply as part of the purchase, there are no further test questions here. The work is not supplies or supplies with incidental services. Let's look at the test for construction. So running down the list of questions to determine if the work is construction, we can tell from the information provided by the requester that replacing the door is not construction, alteration, repair, or improvement of a building, structure, or other real property, and does not fall under the remodeling or decorating, dismantling, demolition, or removal of improvements. While laborers may be used, they are not employed by a construction company, sub, or similar contractor at a building or work site. We are only concerned about removing the existing door and installing a new door we already own in its place. While a new door may seem like an improvement, FAR 2.101 defines an improvement as things like sewer mains, power lines, streets, docks, etc. A new door in this case, while an improvement in functionality of the building, is not an improvement under the definitions for construction. As such, the work is not construction. Lastly, our test for services. Looking again at the questions for services and by process of elimination, The work is a service because it engages the time or effort of a contractor whose primary purpose is to perform a task. This meets the definition of services. Does the work fall under a statutory or regulatory exemption from the service contract labor standards? The work is not one of the listed statutory or regulatory exemptions, so it is not excluded from the service contract labor standards based on statute. Is this work personal or non-personal? Is an employer-employee relationship established? No, so we know we have non-personal services. Is this work considered professional or non-professional services? It's considered non-professional services because we have no professional services that meet the Fair Labor Standards Act exemption as part of this action. The work will be completed by laborers on an hourly basis. So looking at our solution to this case study, our tests for supplies are not met because the supply in question, the door, was purchased separately. While the services are to install a door, which some may consider an improvement, it does not meet the definition of improvements found in FAR subpoint 2.101. Services are also performed by laborers, but they are not employed by a construction company, subcontractor, or similar company at a building site or work site. Therefore, by definition, the work is not construction. The tests for services show us that this is a discrete task and a specific effort, and those are characteristics of service. The service does not meet a statutory or regulatory exemption, and the services are not performed by bona fide professionals under the Fair Labor Standards Act exemption. Therefore, we can determine the need is a service subject to the service contract labor standards and the lower micro purchase threshold of $2,500. Now, please note this example should not be interpreted that all doors being replaced fall under services buys. Doors range from office doors to aircraft hangar doors, and some are easily replaced while others may require retrofitting or other construction-like efforts to be installed. If your requirement is more along the lines of an aircraft hangar door or includes other skills or types of tasks to fit or install the door, it may merit a closer look and consideration as construction. In our final case study, let's really get into a gray area. For this case study, Fort Sill Army Base is home to the Army Training and Doctrine Command, or TRADOC. The base uses parcels of state land to conduct training, and it requires the purchase of land use permits every 5 years. The cardholder has been tasked to buy the permit, which cost $4,000. The micro purchase threshold has increased from $3,500 to $10,000 in recent years, and since the last purchase, the commander wants us to use the purchase card to complete this transaction. The cardholder is looking for your opinion on how to classify this purchase for the purposes of applying the micro purchase threshold. So let's run through our tests and see how best to classify this transaction. Well, looking at our test for supply, we can tell that the work is not a supply because we are not buying an item that meets the characteristics of a supply. While the paper itself that the permit is granted on is a tangible item, what we are buying is the access to land, which is considered intangible. So therefore, the permits are not considered supplies or supplies with incidental services. Let's test for construction. The work does not involve alteration, repair, or improvement of real property and does not meet any of the other tests for construction. Therefore, this work is not construction. And let's look at our last test for the characteristics of a service. The purchase does not engage the time or effort of a contractor whose primary purpose is to perform a task. We are not paying for the effort to process the permit, but the access the permit grants the base to use the land temporarily. The work does not meet the other tests for services and is not covered by any statutory, regulatory, or Fair Labor Standards Act exemption. So what is our solution? What happens when your purchase doesn't clearly fit or easily fit into any category? The FAR definitions of services supply do not always provide clarity in every situation, and the purpose of the permit here, however, may provide some clarity. Are we buying the right to use the land or legal access to the land from an intangible service perspective? In this case, the solution is to acknowledge that the principal purpose is access to state lands. The need isn't tangible. The paper itself is of no value without the access or the intangible thing that it provides. The need does not require performance of work by personnel covered by construction wage rate requirements as stipulated in FAR, and therefore it is not subject to the lower micro purchase threshold of $2,000 for construction. The need also does not require performance of work by personnel covered by service contract labor standards as stipulated in FAR, and therefore is not subject to the service contract labor standards and the lower $2,500 micro purchase for covered services. As a result, the $10,000 micro purchase threshold is appropriate and should be applied. The cardholder can make this purchase using the purchase card. So now that we looked at our case studies, there are other common purchases that could fall into gray areas, like our last case study, where there's no real direction as to the use of the card in those situations. In these cases, and within agency guidelines, the cards can be used up to the micro purchase threshold of $10,000 for purchases like you see listed here. Let's talk about a few of these specifically. When it comes to toll cards, passes, and electronic toll collection systems, and your purchase of individually paid tolls, individual tolls are considered an on-demand requirement, meaning that each demand, or each time you go through a toll booth, is unrelated to the demands that occurred before and after, the other tolls at other locations, maybe by other individuals. Each toll is therefore an individual requirement or transaction. When you're establishing a prepaid toll account, these accounts are considered prepaid, where the account automatically replenishes funds using charges against the purchase card. It's up to individual agency policy if they will allow cardholders to establish prepaid accounts with their purchase card and under which circumstances, and how to establish controls for the use and how such charges will be reconciled. With prepaid accounts, there is a typical monthly recurring charge if tolls have been debited to bring the account back to the required minimum dollar amount. The limits on recurring payments apply in this case and can impact the use of the card in this manner. Agency policy will dictate if purchase cards can be used to secure government accounts for toll systems that require a card on file to charge either per toll or to replenish funds. Also, in the case of easy passes and other accounts where cards are kept on file for the purpose of replenishment of toll funds, the advance payment statute 31 U.S.C. 3324 must be considered. This statute says a payment under a contract to provide a service or deliver an article for the U.S. government may not be more than the value of the service already provided or the article already delivered. This is a lot of fancy language for basically saying if you haven't already received the good or service, you can't pay for it in advance. However, there are industries where advance payment is a stipulation to receive services, such as tolls, and each agency must develop policy in these areas as part of its agency purchase card program management and oversight. For example, the Department of Interior includes a policy on the use of purchase cards to pay for toll passes and transponders in their policy, with circumstances for each. The most recent Federal Highway Administration report on toll facilities, so you can find out about what toll facilities require in your area, can be found at a link provided in your course materials. When it comes to subway tokens and Metro fare cards for non-commuters, offices may use the purchase card to purchase subway tokens, tickets, and Metro fare cards for general use when employees commute across large metropolitan areas as part of their normal job duties, for things such as attending meetings, hearings, or other mission-related activities. Fare cards should not be assigned to individuals, but they should be checked out and returned to a controller. These items are considered cash equivalents and should be secured as such. When it comes to GSA Fleet Undercover Confidential Registration and Tags, where GSA Fleet can accommodate state requirements, it will provide registration and tags as a service to its leasing customers. However, when state requirements do not allow GSA Fleet to do this, or where processing the transaction at the agency level is to the benefit of the agency, GSA Fleet will request the agencies use their purchase card instead, not their fleet card, for these transactions. For example, in Maryland, if GSA Fleet obtains estate plates on behalf of the agency, they only get a 2-year registration. However, if the agency pays directly, it can get a 5-year registration for the same price as 2 years. For these cases, it's more beneficial to the agency and the government as a whole to have the agency directly perform the state plate registration process themselves. In this instance, the agency could use their purchase card for this transaction. And when it comes to parking fees and parking passes, those should be in the name of the agency. Parking passes should not be issued in the name of an employee. Like with toll passes, agency policy will dictate if purchase cards can be used to secure government accounts for parking fees that may require a card on file to charge for parking on a per instance basis. How are equipment rentals classified? Are they a supply? Well, not always. When renting equipment only without an operator, such as renting a forklift delivered for general use by government employees or maybe a military member, The rental is classified as a supply subject to the $10,000 micro purchase threshold. However, 29 CFR 4.131D states that contracts under which the contractor provides equipment with operators for the purposes of construction of a public building or public work, such as road resurfacing or dike repair, even where the work is performed under the supervision of government employees, would be within the exemption of Section 7.1 of the Service Contract Act, and such contracts for construction are subject to the Davis-Bacon Act. And that means that equipment where you're getting an operator with the equipment for the purpose of construction is subject to the lower $2,000 micro purchase threshold for construction. Now, when you're renting equipment and the rental includes an equipment operator, such as a forklift with a forklift operator, and the rental is classified as a service subject to the lower micro purchase threshold, the $2,500 will be the threshold because service contract labor standard covered employees will be utilized in the work effort. 29 CFR 4.131D states that in general, contracts under which the contractor agrees to provide the government with vehicles or equipment on a rental basis with drivers or operators for the purposes of furnishing services are covered by the Service Contract Act. Such contracts are not considered contracts for furnishing equipment within the meaning of the Walsh-Healy Public Contracts Act. And to note, the Walsh-Healy Public Contracts Act does not kick in until the $15,000 threshold. Therefore, it doesn't apply to micro purchases. So just one extra note to throw in on this slide. GSA Fleet operates a short-term rental program. It's called the STR program, and they can provide a variety of vehicle types to include things like forklifts, scissor boom lifts, backhoes, dump trucks, excavators, tractors, refrigerated trucks and trailers, and all sorts of other types of vehicles. In this additional info on how to contact the GSA Transportation and Logistics Service to see if you can purchase a rental through this program, the link for that is found in the presentation materials that you can download as part of this course. So let's switch gears a little and talk about what happens when a vendor wants your cardholder to sign up to terms and conditions as part of a micro purchase made with the card. FAR Subpart 13.202, Unenforceability of Unauthorized Obligations in Micro Purchases, addresses the government's liability when a cardholder signs contractor terms and conditions as part of a micro purchase. FAR 13.202 reads that many supplies or services are acquired subject to supplier license agreements. These are particularly common in the IT acquisitions, but they may apply to any supply or service. For example, computer software and services delivered through the internet are often subject to license agreements, referred to as end-user license agreements or EULAs, terms of services, or other similar legal instruments or agreements. Many of these agreements contain indemnification clauses that are inconsistent with federal law and unenforceable, but which could create a violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act if agreed to by the government. The clause at FAR 52-232-39, Unenforceability of Unauthorized Obligations, automatically applies to any micro purchase, including those made with the government-wide purchase card. This clause prevents such violations of the Anti-Deficiency Act. FAR Clause 52-232-39 states that indemnification of the vendor or any person or entity by the government in terms of damages, costs, fees, or other loss or liability would create an anti-deficiency violation and is therefore unenforceable against the government, and that no government end user shall be deemed to have agreed to such a clause by virtue of it appearing in an EULA, a term of service, or other similar legal instrument or agreement, even if it is invoked through a click on an I agree box or other comparable mechanism. FAR was updated in 2013 to add this protection because trying to negotiate these indemnification clauses out of vendor license agreements on a per purchase basis could sometimes take months. And I have a lot of experience with this from working at the FAA, where we were buying software upgrades for various flight equipment and radar systems. It would take months, and sometimes we couldn't get them out at all. It was a real benefit, even though FAA didn't follow FAR, it follows it very closely and mirrors it, mimics it quite often. And in this case, it did. So many times it was difficult to find a agreeable vendor terms and conditions that we could sign. And we sometimes had to switch and we wouldn't necessarily get the best price or best product. So this was a real savior in that respect, and it's used in an application for micro purchase thresholds is welcomed when government purchase cards are used as the procurement mechanism, and if the vendor requires an agreement with the government and the likes of what we've just talked about. That's real important to include in your policy. When it comes to long-term rentals and short-term leases of land or buildings, that's another quasi-gray area similar to our last case study. Leasing space is not a service contract labor standards covered action. And per the SmartPay 3 master contract, the contractor must have a mechanism to further restrict the use of the purchase card for the purchase or acquisition of long-term rentals or lease of land or buildings. Long-term is defined as any rental or lease agreement that extends beyond a 12-month period and is intended for more than a temporary basis. In the case of long-term rentals or lease of land or buildings, the purchase card may only be used as a payment mechanism and only within the account holder's authorized purchase limits, consideration of recurring payment limitations, and consideration of agency organization-specific policies. The purchase card may, however, be used as a procurement and payment mechanism in the case of short-term rentals or leases, also within the account holder's authorized purchase limits and after consideration of agency organization-specific policies. Short-term rentals or leases are defined as those rentals or leases with a duration of less than 12 months. You can see some examples of short-term leases, and appropriate uses could be something like purchase or payment of a conference facility to house a 5-day conference or meeting, or purchase and payment of an office space to house an organization for 3 months during response to a natural disaster. Leasing space, again, is not a service contract labor standards covered action. So again, switching gears, the topic of training has been a debated subject over the years. Is it or isn't it subject to the micro purchase threshold for services? In the Purchase Essentials class over the years, we tried to provide guidance to cardholders based on the most common agency policies, but even those policies can vary greatly. And again this year, we took another step back and tried to break this information down even further than in previous years to look at the governing regulations behind providing employee training of any type, whether it's college courses, training courses, webinars and seminars, registration at training conferences, etc. And we tried to provide examples of FAR and non-FAR based training actions and application of the micro purchase thresholds. The Government Employees Training Act, or GETA, Public Law 85-507, gives each federal agency general authority for employee training. The law is codified in U.S. Code Title V, Government Organization Employees, Part 3, Employees, Subpart C, Employee Performance, and Chapter 41, Training. That section basically says that the head of any agency may pay or reimburse the employee for all or part of the necessary expenses of training, including tuition and matriculation fees, library and laboratory services, and the purchase or rental of books, materials, and supplies. So based on this site, agencies may choose to decide that training and education or professional development, when authorized on the agency's training form, which is typically the SF-182, is not a FAR-based transaction. And as such, the micro purchase for services would not apply to these types of transactions. One agency that has done this in particular is the Department of Defense. They have made a determination and have delegated certain card holders the authority to use their purchase cards to purchase training up to a cap of $25,000 per transaction per training request when authorized on an SF-182. The policy for using the purchase card for training, again, varies by agency. Along with the dollar value of the proposed transaction, other considerations must be made. Things like, has your agency determined the classification of various training transactions as FAR-based transactions or not? Is the training at your agency approved on an SF-182 form or an equivalent? And is the training being purchased allowable under the Government Employees Training Act? How is the purchase card being used? Are you trying to use the card to purchase training as a procurement mechanism on the open market or ordering mechanism against an existing contract? Or do you only want to use it as a payment mechanism to pay for training acquired by other means? And what type of training is being purchased? Is it an individual slot in an existing course? Is it an existing course for import to the agency? Tailored training, or maybe a subscription for training access? Training can be procured government from government and non-government sources, and training from non-government sources must be for regularly scheduled commercial off-the-shelf courses, training conferences, or instruction available to the general public and priced the same for everybody in the same category. That's the same price per student, per course, per program, service, or space. While some agencies allow the purchase of tailored training up to the micro-purchase threshold, others require that any tailored training must be procured by a warranted contracting officer. Depending on the subject matter of the training, if it is created, modified, or of a type that requires knowledge of an advanced type in a field of science or learning, tailored training courses may also be considered professional services and subject to the higher micro-purchase threshold of $10,000. If your agency has not determined training to be non-FAR-based actions, then this distinction could be important for you. Tailored training usually requires a detailed statement of work and other quality policy reviews by a cadre of individuals that may include an agency training office, human resources, or other professionals. And many agencies have decided that any tailored training will be procured by their contracting office. Agency and local policies should govern in this case. And when it comes to the review of other agency policies related to training, are there any human resources, employee training and development, or procurement policies in place related to your training purchase? Sometimes there are different types of supporting documentation required for college courses leading to a degree versus training as part of a leadership development program or just an industry certification. The answers to these questions should be considered in combination with a review of specific agency-level training, human resource, employee development, and procurement regulations, particularly if your agency government charge card policy is silent regarding transactions for training. The answer as to the limit for the use of the card could vary from micro-purchase thresholds for services of $2,500 in the case of tailored training to an amount over the micro-purchase threshold of $10,000 if it's established as part of your agency policies. Agencies purchase training differently depending on the agency purchase and training policies, funding, and the financial management system used. At many agencies, including GSA, the process and use of the card for training applies differently depending on if the purchase is for individual training slots on existing courses, importing a course to an agency, such as bringing in a retirement training seminar, or purchasing training through a subscription service for training access. Agencies, again, should have clear policies about whether training slots can or cannot be grouped and coordinate these decisions with auditors so that sufficient supporting documentation, such as SF-182s or other approvals, are part of the purchase card log. Whether purchased separately or grouped, slots for individual training can come up as a flag in purchase card audits and appear to be split purchases, especially when purchased at the same day or with the same vendor. When you're buying individual training slots in existing courses, each slot is purchased and considered its own transaction, even when it's paid together. The purchase card can be used up to the cardholder's single purchase limit in accordance with agency guidelines. Let's look at two examples for purchasing individual slots. In our first example, the agency has decided that training authorized on the SF-182 is not a FAR-based action. Agency policy states that cardholders may purchase training up to their single purchase limit, and in this case, the cardholder's single purchase limit is $25,000. The cardholder has been asked to procure 5 individual slots in a FAR boot camp at $3,000 each, and each slot was authorized on an SF-182. In this case, the cardholder may either purchase the 5 slots as separate transactions or combine transactions up to their single purchase limit if allowed by agency policy. The cardholder can combine the transactions up to their single purchase limit because training is not considered a FAR-based action, so there is no issue with splitting requirements, which is a FAR prohibition. In our second example, the agency has not made any determination about training and whether it is a FAR-based action. Agency policy does say, however, that training purchases for 2 or more individuals are considered separate and distinct actions. Cardholders are also allowed by policy to combine training purchases up to the $10,000 micro-purchase threshold or the cardholder's single purchase limit, whichever is less. In this case, the cardholder's single purchase limit is $10,000. The cardholder has been asked to pay the tuition for 5 employees in a 3-course advanced government contracting certificate program. Tuition is $6,000 per employee for the 3 courses, and each individual course is authorized on an SF-182. In this example, even though the agency has not decided that training is not a FAR-based action, The agency policy states that training purchases for 2 or more individuals are considered separate transactions and that each purchase can be combined. Since each class, was authorized on its own SF 182, the cardholder can choose if they want to combine the transactions for a single individual or more than one individual up to their single purchase limit. Now, when I purchased training, I always purchased each slot individually and required the vendor to bill me separately. While this could be a little cumbersome, it was very helpful when multiple fund sites are being used, different accounting streams for different offices, for example, or in the case of folks missing classes due to illness or other issues. Credits were easy to get and track based on the individual transaction. So that's just something I did, but you can do it however it works, more streamlined for you. Purchase of a complete commercial course are FAR-based actions. The way in which the card will be used will dictate the micro-purchase threshold that applies. The card can be used as a procurement mechanism on the open market to purchase existing commercial training courses to import to an agency up to the $10,000 micro-purchase in accordance with agency policy. The card can be used only as an ordering mechanism by a non-warranted cardholder under the micro-purchase threshold when the purchase card is accepted as an ordering method in the contract terms and conditions. Over the micro-purchase threshold of $10,000, if the contract terms and conditions allow it, a cardholder who is also a warranted contracting officer or duly authorized ordering officer may place orders so long as the total amount of the order does not exceed the lesser of the single purchase limit or their warrant. When buying existing training courses, these are complete courses not tailored to the government, the micro-purchase threshold of $10,000 can be used based on the aggregated total cost of the course. Costs may not be split up to circumvent the micro-purchase threshold. For example, do not split costs between instructor time, labor, materials, etc. We go over this in the GSA SmartPay Purchase Management Essentials course, but it's worth repeating here specific to training. Buying training courses is a FAR-based action and not subject to the waiver of FAR requirements unless agency procurement policy dictates. For example, you're buying a one-day Myers-Briggs seminar for 35 employees at a total cost of $9,500. The purchase card can be used as a procurement, ordering, and payment mechanism because it falls within the $10,000 micro-purchase threshold. In example 2, you're buying a 3-day mid-career retirement course for 150 participants held at your headquarters. The cost of the course is $30,000. Do not take the $30,000 course price and divide it by 150 participants to arrive at a price per student and think you can simply pay for 150 separate slots combined or split those payments against the micro-purchase threshold. The micro-purchase threshold must be applied to the aggregate price of $30,000. In this case, the cost exceeds the micro-purchase threshold and must be purchased using the card as an ordering mechanism against an existing contract or procured on the open market by both a warranted contracting officer, or both by a warranted contracting officer, excuse me. That contracting officer has to do the ordering or the procurement on the open market. The purchase card can also be used as a payment mechanism within the single purchase limit of the cardholder and agency policy. Now, as we talked about in the Purchase Card Essentials class, orders over the micro-purchase threshold may only be placed by a warranted contracting officer or duly appointed ordering officer, who again is a cardholder with a single purchase limit sufficient to place the order, and then only when allowed under the terms and conditions of the contract that they're placing the order against. Both the card limit and the contracting officer's warrant limits apply to the transaction. So, for example, an unlimited warrant and a single transaction limit of $250,000 means that the orders cannot exceed $250,000, the lesser of the two. The certification of funds availability is also required prior to making these purchases. The use of the card as a payment mechanism must be an authorized payment method also in the terms and conditions and agreed upon by the vendor, and cardholders should not exceed their single purchase limit to make payments. Payments may be split if allowed by agency policy, though it is not recommended or endorsed due to audit implications. Procuring tailored training courses is a FAR-based action and a service that typically requires a statement of work from the government describing the requirement or a similar document, and performance of work by individuals to develop training materials, guides, visual aids, and instruction using the same. Tailored training may involve creating a new course or tailoring an existing commercial off-the-shelf course to a specific agency, such as a leadership development program or maybe a kickoff training. This type of training should be purchased via a formal contract by a warranted contracting officer unless agency policy allows otherwise. Procuring subscriptions for training access for a website or training portal is also possible, and in this case, the purchase is a subscription for access to on-demand training, and the micro-purchase threshold applies to the dollar value of the total cost of the subscription. Subscription services for groups or organizations typically set a threshold or limit to the number of employees who can access the training services via the subscription for a flat cost. The costs are not prorated or adjusted by the number of actual employees that access the training. For example, you can buy a subscription to a training vendor's on-demand site for a cost of $9,000. Up to 2,500 employees could access the on-demand training under the subscription. In this case, the purchase could be made with the purchase card because it falls within the $10,000 micro-purchase threshold. Now, switching gears again, let's talk about the Federal Procurement Data System, FPDS, and reporting as required under the SmartPay contracts. If your agency is required to report to the Federal Procurement Data System, or FPDS, FAR states that as a minimum, agencies must report all contract actions over the micro-purchase threshold awarded under indefinite delivery vehicles, or IDVs. This includes all calls and orders. Some examples of IDVs include task and delivery order contracts, such as government-wide acquisition contracts and multi-agency contracts, GSA schedule contracts, and blanket purchase agreements or basic ordering agreements. Given that the GSA Center for Charge Card Management also reports purchase card data to FPDS both over and under the micro-purchase threshold, questions have been received as to whether agencies and organizations should report orders under these IDVs when the order falls at or below the micro-purchase threshold and the order was placed using the purchase card. There have been concerns that if an agency submits a direct report to FPDS for such an order, it could result in duplicative FPDS data reporting. The question has also been asked if coding data element 6N, purchase card as a payment method, with a yes would alleviate concerns of duplicative records. The GSA SmartPay Bulletin 26 addresses these concerns. CCCM provides purchase card data to FPDS as part of our responsibilities under the Government Purchase Card Program as outlined in FAR Subpart 4.606. The data CCCM reports to FPDS is housed outside the regular database and is not commingled with data submitted by agencies and organizations, so this should remove any concerns regarding duplicative reporting. CCCM reports only agency-level data, such as the total number of transactions and total dollars. We do not associate orders placed using the purchase card to specific indefinite delivery vehicles. If an agency or organization requires FPDS contain the data for the purposes of tracking and monitoring IDV-specific utilization, agencies and organizations must report those orders directly to FPDS themselves. Agencies and organizations have the option to consolidate FPDS reporting for orders at or below the micro-purchase threshold when placed with the purchase card that could otherwise be administratively burdensome to report separately. The FPDS express reports can be used for this purpose, as outlined in FAR Subpart 4.606. For example, an agency organization may have a single IDV where 50% of the orders for the month were placed with the purchase card and fall at or below the micro-purchase threshold, and the rest were placed by contracting officers over the micro-purchase threshold. In this case, the agency organization would report all orders over the micro-purchase threshold using separate contract action reports as required by FAR. This is the normal process. But the agency could also choose to combine all orders that fall under the micro-purchase threshold under a single IDV-specific express report for the purposes of tracking that total IDV utilization. When FPDS express reports are used to combine micro-purchases for the purposes of tracking IDV utilization, they should be submitted at least monthly. When either FPDS cards or express reports are utilized, data element 6N, purchase card as a payment method, would be coded yes when the purchase card was or will be used to pay the contractor for orders being reported. Data element 6N provides an indication that the action was backed by a contract vehicle or document where paperless methods of invoicing and payment were used. Now we're going to go over some best practices and audit findings in the management of your purchase card program as found in OMB Circular A123 Appendix B, and tips and tricks from some of your peers. When it comes to maximizing the use of reports and bank association tools, under the SmartPay 3 contracts, there are numerous mandatory reports available at the agency organization level, and they are listed in section C731 of the master contract found on the GSA SmartPay website. There are reports such as approving official listings, span of control, current accounts reports, invoice status reports, statistical summary reports, and transaction dispute reports, just to name a few. Ad hoc reports are also available, and if you don't know how to pull your own queries and have not yet received training, you can contact your Level 1 AOPC for information on how to schedule that. Leveraging purchasing power and using category strategic solutions that permit the use of charge card as an ordering and payment mechanism is another best practice. The federal government spends billions of dollars each year through purchase card programs, and each transaction has the potential to increase the sourcing power of the government. Purchase program managers should be aware of any agency-specific requirements to ensure compliance with strategic sourcing. They should work with category managers to ensure the agency is leveraging category management solutions, and it is the responsibility of purchase card managers to ensure that cardholders are aware of these agency policies for the use of strategic sourcing contracts. Agency organizations should share their purchase card reports with the category manager and program management office, and the data can be analyzed by the agency to evaluate purchase patterns and assess if there are opportunities to better leverage the government's buying power through category management. Often these contracts or ordering vehicles can include the use of the purchase card to streamline the acquisition process and further value through the generation of refunds. Things like initial focus on high volume and commonly used supplies. Keeping the program simple by starting to focus on awarding blanket purchase agreements against GSA scheduled program and considering the use of eBuy to help put these in place. You can leverage vendors who have already have highly evolved web-based ordering systems and can provide quick delivery. And you can develop communication strategy to effectively get the word out about discounted contracts to your cardholders. These are just a few of the ways that this can work for you. When it comes to instituting internal management controls to mitigate risk of misuse or delinquency, agencies should consider implementing strict internal controls that mitigate charge card risk to the greatest extent possible, perform periodic reviews of spending and transaction limits to ensure appropriateness, conduct internal charge card program reviews on a regular basis to ensure internal control mechanisms are adequate, monitor reports to identify potential split purchases, and perform periodic reviews of the number of charge card accounts in use for appropriateness, as well as the number of evaluating the span of control for approving officials in your agency. Also, keeping current on new and innovative solutions to detect and identify potential fraud, misuse, and delinquency. You can do things like use data analytics, block card use for high-risk merchant category codes, use more restrictive spending limits during expected periods of inactivity, which is what a lot of people have done during the pandemic, use periodic review of cardholder accounts for continued necessity, and establish a control to ensure that card accounts are canceled when the employee retires or leaves the agency. When it comes to initiating administrative or disciplinary actions for card misuse, abuse, and repeated account delinquency, agencies must otherwise comply with all applicable laws and regulatory guidance in determining whether or not to impose disciplinary or adverse action in any specific case. This can include initiating verbal counseling and warnings, providing written warnings, suspending or revoking charge card privileges, suspending or revoking employee security clearances, having evaluations include misuse or delinquency occurrences when it comes to employee performance, suspending or terminating employment, and ensuring consistent enforcement of such penalties, and publish the actions that you've taken for misuse of charge cards. Learn from others by reviewing audit reports and findings as well. At GSA at smartpay.gsa.gov, we maintain a repository of audit reports related to charge card programs. A few of those reports for purchase cards are currently posted and are for, you can see reports for Department of Housing and Urban Development for 2017 and 2018. GSA had an audit in 2018. The Department of Interior had an audit in 2019. Amtrak had an audit in 2019. The Air Force Non-Appropriated Fund Program had an audit in 2019, and DoD Purchase also had an audit in 2019. So there's a lot of good information out there in the audit repository, and you can see the link here on this slide. There are several internal controls that can and should be instituted to mitigate risk as part of normal program management. Assignment of duties separated by individuals. Something to consider are Are the duties at your agency or organization separated out for authorizing, approving, and recording transactions, receiving assets, approving statements, making payments, certifying funds, and reviews and audits when possible? When it comes to the appointment process for cardholders and approving officials, do you have a process for card application, issuing appointment letters to cardholders and approving officials to define their roles and responsibilities? And is there adequate recurring training? When it comes to the span of control, is the number of cardholders assigned to each AO reasonable? Is the number of cardholders and AOs assigned to an AOPC reasonable, given the volume and spend and your organizational structure? When it comes to transaction approval processes, is there a policy in place about how purchases are approved? Are they approved prior to the purchase, and if so, by whom? Should the approval always be in writing, and is there a desired format that lists specific information that should be included? And when it comes to reconciliation and delinquency controls, are you using the canned reports available to you under the electronic data system for your bank? Has your agency worked with your bank for customized alerts? Are your statements being reviewed promptly? What is your audit process, and how often do you audit? OMB Circular A-123, Appendix B, Section 2.4, Purchase Card Internal Controls, talks to specifics about having such questions and more answered as part of your agency policies for the charge card program. When looking through audit reports, regardless of the agency and the fiscal year, there is a pattern of finding that exists. Learning from these patterns provides direction on what areas to target in your annual review of your program management controls, your purchase card policies and guides, and refresher training and other training materials you may give your cardholders as part of their day-to-day use of the card and your day-to-day management of the program. Things like strengthening systematic oversight and internal controls to include regularly reviewing hierarchies and maintaining account status, internal audits of purchase card transactions, files, and logs, identifying split purchases and patterns for potential misuse and noncompliance with policy, and looking at other categories of high-risk purchases and appropriate disciplinary action when misuse and abuse are found, such as suspending cardholders and approving officials who fail to take training or repeat offenders. Look at strengthening documentation to support purchases and ensure written authority and description of the product or services is always present, obtained proof of purchase, and proof the government received the supplies or purchases, such as a third-party receipt. Making sure you educate approving officials on what to look for in the review of a transaction on the cardholder statement and provide regular training as a refresher. And educating cardholders about what constitutes an improper purchase, that sales tax must be removed at the time of purchase when appropriate, and to rotate vendors when making competitive purchases. Now, the review of sales tax, or removal of sales tax, is a requirement because the cards are tax exempt. However, there could be surcharges or other fees that may not be able to be removed. And we go into that a lot in the tax class that Andrew Lee gives. And that's a really good class. I'd highly recommend it. Get a lot of tidbits to take back to your cardholders. You know, it's been said that the best way to learn is from mistakes of others. So using these mistakes to poke holes in your own policies and procedures and training to make sure they're airtight is a great way to keep your program running in tip-top shape and to sustain future audit scrutiny. So here's a quick rundown of the learning objectives again that we had for today. I hope that you feel we've addressed all these thoroughly and you're comfortable that you have information you need to help make decisions, tighten your program management and oversight, and apply these things to your daily work as an AOPC. If you've got questions after the forum about this presentation or any others you see this week, feel free to contact the GSA SmartPay Support Center by email at gsa_smartpay@gsa.gov or by phone and to speak to a live person at area code 703-605-2808. We're open Monday through Friday and man the lines 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern, but we are closed on federal holidays. If you have any questions specific about this presentation or purchase card management in general, or the use or classification of a purchase, you can email me directly at shauna.weatherly@gsa.gov. This presentation is intended as a general information only and does not carry the force of legal opinion. So just wanted to put that out there so everyone knows that GSA is not saying that if your agency policy says something different, that this is how it must be. This is all general information. And it does not override your agency policy. It does not override the FAR, U.S. State Code, or the Code of Federal Regulations. The Federal Register and the Code of Federal Regulations remain the official source for regulatory information published by the Department of Labor when it comes to things like the Davis-Bacon Act, the Service Contract Labor Standards, and the Department of Labor Field Operations Handbook. All of the resources you see listed here are where we took the information from today's training. I want to thank you again for attending this session, and please stay on the line for our live Q&A.